Can you just say yes if you can see the screen now?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, again, this week we have so far Stephanie and Chantal and Barbara and Angeli. We're still waiting for Chris and Georgette. If they don't join us, when we do our paired conversations, it'll be Stephanie and Barbara and Chantal and Angeli. If only one of them joins us, I'm going to have them join Barbara and Stephanie and have a three-person conversation. If everyone joins, then we'll be in pairs. So just so you know that part. This week is session number 5. We are almost halfway through the course. And today, this is the first of 2 sessions where we're going to be talking about research design, so how you actually design your research projects. This week, we're going to be focusing on 3 methods of data collection. And next week, we're going to talk about the who, what, and how of data collection. So both this week and next week are about data collection. This week is going to be introducing some methods. Next week, we're going to look at questions of validity and reliability and sampling methods and those kinds of things. One of the things to keep in mind is that researchers, including actual researchers, spend years becoming experts in data collection, but that with even just a little bit of training, you can become better at collecting data that'll be meaningful to the research question that you are asking. Most of you are probably going to use one of the methods that we're going to be talking about today. But even if you don't use them, we do encourage you to take some time to look at the optional reading that we attached and look at some of the other methods that you can use. A lot of action research tends to use the same methods, but it's always good to be aware that there are other methods that are available that may be relevant to your particular question. So again, the question we're asking today is, what are the data methods that I'm going to use on my action research project? And to get us started, we are going to watch about the first 6 minutes of a longer video produced by the Center for Collaborative Action Research at Pepperdine University at their Graduate School of Education and Psychology. I should mention that this is part of a series, and the entire series is available for free online. And again, today we're going to look at about the first 6.5 minutes.
And I'm back to talk today about data collection. And now I know for some of you, especially novice action researchers, will be a little bit nervous about data collection. And that's understandable because it might not be something that you've ever done before. But don't worry, you'll learn as you move forward. Since action research is a process of continual learning, over time, you will develop the expertise to be really efficient and skillful action researchers. So don't worry, this is your first time. You will develop the skills that you need to be able to do your first cycles of research. In previous tutorials, you developed your action research question and your logic model. Both of those will help you with your first activity in this tutorial, which is to develop your data collection plan. So you start with your logic model and you look at what your near outcomes are. And those near outcomes should have been what you use to form your research question. I suggested a research question in the form of, if I, and then describe the action that you plan to take fairly specifically, how or what effect will it have on? And then that outcome that you're looking for is what you need to measure. So if your outcome is student engagement, then you need to think about what evidence would help you determine whether or not students were more engaged. If your outcome was a learning outcome, then an assessment test of their knowledge might be a better outcome. If you're trying to increase collaboration or peer editing or collaborative work within the workplace, those are different kinds of outcomes, and each of them will have a kind of measurement that is appropriate for the outcome that you're looking for. So activity 1 is your data collection plan. So the first thing you're going to have to decide on is, what data am I going to collect? You can collect what people think, say, or feel about what happened by using interviews or questionnaires or surveys. Focus groups can be effective. Those are all different ways of getting at people's perspective in the setting, and those are commonly used in action research. You can also use data that records what people do. As I said a minute ago, if you were looking at student learning, then an assessment test of some kind, either a self-assessment, a test, a quiz, some kind of a rubric, even the student's ability to be able to create a rubric could be evidence of their understanding of the task that you're trying to create. The other thing you can look at is what people do. To do this, you can look at performances in the classroom or in the workplace. You can count or check things. So it can be attendance, it can be things, if you're working online, it can be computer records. You can also sample during the course of an activity. So a frequent measure that is used in educational research is time on task. So at regular intervals, you can have your watch beep at 5-minute intervals, or just make a quick scan and give a percent of the people in the classroom or in the workplace or in the workshop that are on task. And then you can look at whether increase in or decrease in time on task as you change the nature of the task. You can also collect things like photographs or videotapes or audio tapes that you can then use to look at behavior again and again. So, one way of collecting data is to collect it in the setting, making marks or taking records as things are happening. Another is to have a recording device, either an audio tape, a video tape, photographs, that give you a chance to look more closely at the data future point. And attendance at meetings, logs of meetings, things that happened in the meeting. One of the other kinds of measures that people sometimes use is where do people go for help in the setting? So how many questions were asked, who asked the questions, what kinds of questions were they? Looking to see where help was both offered and given is another way of, measuring the outcome of a particular implementation. Because if there is a lot of need for help, then it gives you some clue about the kinds of things that the students or the coworkers found difficult. So the next question in your data collection plan is...
That's the next slide. Okay, that's where we're going to stop that video. And I just wanted to re-emphasize the 4 reasons for collecting data that the presenter was talking about. And she said that there are 4 reasons why you might collect data. The first is that you want to understand other people's perspectives, and she talked about some data collection tools for doing that, which will be familiar to most of us, and they would include things like interviews, and interviews can be student interviews, they can be parent interviews, they can be done singly, they can be done in pairs. She talked about focus groups, which is a type of interview which is done with a group of people who are selected for specific reasons. Questionnaires and surveys are other types of tools that you could use to understand perspectives. Another reason for data collection is that you may want to measure learning outcomes. And of course here, the types of assessments are really large and huge. And those assessments could be teacher-created, they could be peer assessments, they could be self-assessments. And these are assessments of learning. So these are assessments that are measuring understanding, dispositions, and skills. You also could be interested in the reason for collecting data could be to document the outputs of what you're doing. And to document outputs, you would use logs, you could use notes, you would use lesson plan reflections, you could video record an activity, you could create a series of photos around the teaching that you're doing. You may also want to collect data for the purpose of documenting help requests. And here specifically, we're talking about the type and frequency of help requests that you would get, whether they're from students or whether they're from colleagues, if this was a teacher level project. And again, the reasons that you'd have for data collection are going to depend on your individual research questions. In our first activity, we are going to do a paired chat, and we have had Chris join us now. So Chris is going to be paired with Anjali, and Stephanie, Barbara, and Chantal are going to be paired. I know that Chantal isn't feeling well, so you still may want to use your Skype devices to do that group chat. In a moment, we're going to start the chat, but let me introduce the question that I'd like you to start by discussing this afternoon. I want to first recognize that all of you are involved in data collection every single day as part of your practice. And what I want you to think about right now is, as part of your regular practice, whether that's as a teacher or whether that's as an administrator, what data collection methods do you already use? How do you use data? And what's different about data use in action research, or what do you perceive to be a difference in data for action research versus the data that you're using day to day? I want to give you 10 minutes for this paired discussion. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to pose each of those questions one at a time and ask you to raise your hand and share either some of the things that you shared with the person you were speaking with or some of the things that you discussed together. Again, you're going to have 10 minutes for this paired or group of three discussion, and we will let you know when there is 1 minute remaining. So again, if you want to, please go ahead and use your Skype devices to call up the other person you're paired with today. Again, Anjali and Chris, and Chantal, Stephanie, and Barbara.
Anjali, what's your Skype address?
Yeah, I'm just typing that in. It's Anjali. I have so many, I've forgotten mine. So Anjali underscore Tyagi 1.
Underscore. Oh, that's not.
I've just sent you.
I was just going to try and do it straight away.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. If everyone is set, we're going to go ahead and mute the microphones and start the time.
Right, got it on my phone. It just says an email from Okay, everyone, you have 1 minute left. If you need more time, just put a message into the chat box. But we have 1 minute left. Thank you.
Okay. All right. If I can call everybody back from your discussion.
Barbara.
What I would like to do now is I'd like to go through those questions one at a time. And if you'll use your little yellow hand in the control panel on the right, just to raise your hand to respond to the questions. And then, of course, put your hand down after you've responded so that we know that, that you're not raising your hand for the next question as well. We're going to start with the first question. What data collection methods do you already use and how do you use them? Can we have somebody share some of the things they talked about? Angeli.
Yeah, so what I shared with Chris was that in a regular teaching scenario, I'm using a lot of formative assessment tasks. I do ask for student feedback maybe at the start of or end of lesson just to see what their confidence levels are and how do I use them, especially summative assessments. When you have a record of summative assessments, I ask students to reflect on them, set a new goal for themselves for the next assessment. So that's how I use it to also modify my teaching if their confidence level is very low in one of the subject areas.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Chris, go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously I was talking to Angeli, so we agreed in a lot. I also, I gather data, I'm given data on the students, obviously Chem and MAP scores, which MAP not so much, that's more sort of setting purposes, but for the Chem we can use it in a dialogue with the students about where they feel their IB target should be. But otherwise it's very much we do pre-test for the course and sort of look at their growth. So I might use the same test again after a unit to see how much progress they've made. But it's very much individually tailored support. So I would, any assignments or tests that I mark for the students, I would then put into their gradebook with a comment about where they focus their review or their learning. So you need to learn your keywords or you need to practice graphing skills or whatever it is that they need to target. But it's personalized. It's not as a whole class. So I could see that would be different.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
Oh, Stephanie.
Stephanie, go ahead, please.
It was Barbara. You know, when you look at the data collection strategies in that book, in the handbook, there isn't many that we don't use over the course of the year. Especially when we're doing writing, you're measuring the growth. So they start off with a baseline like this, and then you see at the end, and you look at how they progress through the year using sort of continuums, using what else? Yeah, just observational notes. You're using their artifacts and you're making notes and you're looking and you conferencing, that's the word. You know, I spend a lot of time conferencing with my students about how, what they must work on, their goals and strategies that we use. So, yeah, it's really hard and fast, like you can give them a grade. It's more a continuum.
Great, thank you for that, Barbara. One of the things, just as an observation from this end of the screen, one of the things that we heard a lot about were examples of assessments or data collection methods that are measuring learning outcomes. And of course, because we're all engaged in teaching, that is probably always going to dominate the kinds of data collection that we do. I did hear a couple of examples of people talking about data collection methods that involved understanding students' perspectives. And I think that it was Anjali who talked about collecting student feedback, and Barbara just now who talked about conferencing. And again, both of those data collection techniques are very different from measuring learning outcomes. They're actually trying to get the perspective of learners. Now, interestingly, when we talk about learner outcomes, I think that we have a completely different way of documenting that data as opposed to the way that we document things like student feedback or conferencing. And so it leads really nicely into our next question, which is what's different about data use or data collection in action research? Would anyone like to raise their hand and respond to that question? Chris, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned to Anjali, I was sort of saying that we all do the student surveys because it's a requirement of Strong, and I also get feedback from the principal on what the parent survey comments are for my department, and so I do look at that, but I don't use it in my classroom. So with the action research, that would become much more of a focus for how I would move forwards. And I definitely think, talking to Anjali, that we were both considering actual student interviews. I talk to students on a very casual one-to-one basis about how they feel their classes are going or what they like about different classes, but I think it could become much more formalized in the action research process, actually interviewing the students and documenting that as evidence, or using focus groups even.
Yeah. Chris, thank you for that. Anyone else? Anjali?
Yeah, I'm going to add to what Chris has said. I was thinking about that one thing that differs from how I collect data and how I use data, and what's going to be different in action research is having structured questions for interviews, having very focused questions for interviews, rather than just generally asking how was the lesson at the end of each lesson, or how, what they want to move forward with. So with action research, I definitely feel interviews have a lot of power to get or collect evidence, and also supported by photographic evidence, recordings. I think that is going to be a wide range of data collection, not just quantitative, but also qualitative.
Anjali, thank you for that. And in fact, we're going to be talking a little bit more about interviews later on in the course this afternoon. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Georgette has joined us online. Welcome, Georgette.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Again, let me just kind of summarize some of the things that I think that I heard. And one of the things, of course, is when you're collecting data related to action research, that the data that you collect is going to be related to your research question. You may continue to collect a whole range of data in order to provide the kind of information and feedback to students about their growth and progress that you do as part of your practice. But in addition to that, you'll be collecting some data specifically for your action research piece. And it's interesting to note that what you collect for your action research question may or may not be about individual student progress or attainment. You may be much more interested in the group data, or what the group is telling you, or what the group is learning. And in order to do that, you're going to need to use multiple data sources. And again, both Anjali and Chris talked about the use of the parent surveys, whether they're survey data that you're collecting as part of your Strong work, or looking at parent surveys, or surveys that you're giving just to your particular class. And those surveys are going to be looking at a range of things, not necessarily just students' interest in the academic piece. They're going to be looking more broadly probably at enjoyment and engagement, which we know are both precursors for effective learning. One of the things about collecting data for your action research project, even if you're collecting student feedback, is that it's done in a formal way. And as Anjali was saying, that's using oftentimes structured interview questions that you've thought about prior to actually using them. And again, one of the things that's come out is that the data that you're going to be collecting, unlike assessment data, student assessment data, may not necessarily be quantitative. It may be much more qualitative in nature. And in one of our future sessions, we're going to talk about how you can actually analyze that qualitative data. So thank you very much for those responses. What I want to do now is, again, just take another look at some of the data collection you're probably already using in your practice and talk about them a little bit. The first one has to do with artifacts of learning. And again, this is probably the most common type of data collection that you use in your practice, but it will also probably feature prominently in your research question, because the point of most action research is to somehow add something a little bit extra to what students are learning. And so being able to actually assess that students are learning as well or better than other teaching strategies you may have used is an important part. And of course, in this case, you're going to be using both formative and summative assessments. And you can think, again, just reflect yourself on the range of formative and summative assessments that you're currently using. Building on what some of the comments are that we just heard from people in response to that question, I want to talk a little bit about observations. And observations are literally what you can see. When you look around your classroom, you're looking at what students are doing, what do you see? Observations are not inferences. They're not statements of what you think is happening or interpretations of what you see. It's literally what you see. So in this case, you might look around this image and say that there are a certain number of students who are all writing right now. You can similarly say that there's one or two students who appear not to be focused on the task, looking off in other directions. Those would be things that are actually looking in all directions would be an observation, not on task as an inference. The important thing about observations is that they only become data when they're recorded and later analyzed. Observations are typically recorded as descriptive data, qualitative data, and they use words to describe in depth the observations that you're making, typically on a small set of participants. And again, once observations are recorded, you can go back and organize that data, and you can code the data and turn it into qualitative data. And again, we're going to be discussing data coding in one of our future sessions. It's important to know that when you're doing an observation, that there are a lot of different ways that you can record that. You can use checklists of relevant behaviors that you have developed in advance. You can actually photograph what you're seeing and use either actually photographs or video recordings and go back and analyze those later. That tends to be a fairly easy way. If you have a very fast-moving class where you're actually involved in a lot of interactions with students, it's often difficult to step back and fill out a checklist or to use a checklist. It's much easier to take some photographs, to take a little bit of video footage, and to go back later and analyze what you were seeing or what was happening in the classroom. They can be recorded in the form of notes, but again, notes can be fairly time-consuming while you're trying to teach. And you can also record observations immediately following a class. You can journal your observations. And there you just want to keep in mind that that's what you're doing, because journaling the observations will never be quite as fresh and precise as if you're recording them as they're happening or if you're recording them from a video document. I just want to look really quickly because you'll all be familiar with a lot of observation forms. And this particular form uses a combination of a checklist. So in this case, the teacher is watching for specific academic behaviors, but then she's adding comments and notes which talk about the specific strategies that these students are using to achieve or to demonstrate those behaviors. So an observation sheet can be as simple as a check sheet where you're just ticking boxes to say when you see certain behaviors happening, but it can also include brief notes when you want to have a little bit more detail about the observation. All right, I want you to practice making some observations. Here is an image, and raise your hand and tell me what you see. And remember, these are observations, not inferences. So, Anjali.
Student in action.
Okay. Chris.
I see a boy balancing on an orange object with just his hands and a man in a white shirt watching while another guy just out of view is standing.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Stephanie, Barbara.
Stephanie or Barbara?
I see a whole bunch of medals in the background.
Okay.
Because it's a photo, you don't know if he was supposed to stand to do that for 5 seconds or 10 seconds, or whether that was just a snapshot and then he collapsed or
Or he's
something.
moving.
So,
Yep.
you know. with
Yep.
his arms around
Similarly, you don't know if this is a competition that's in progress or if those medals are simply in the background waiting for something that's going to be happening later. Yep. So again, one of the things we always want to keep in mind when we're observation is we need to consider and think about the potential assumptions that we could bring to an observation. And again, observations are statements of what we see. They're not inferences. And so it's always important to recognize the kind of assumptions you bring to every situation so that you can record observations as accurately as possible. In this next slide, again, what do you see?
Awkward.
4 intersecting lines.
Okay, 4 intersecting lines.
crosses.
Crosses.
I see 2 lines in 2 separate crosses. One appears smaller than the other.
Okay. So let me ask this question a little bit differently. If you learned that this image represented 2 utility poles, how does that change your perception?
Oh, that's awkward.
Chris.
Very good.
I notice what's missing, so there's no wires connecting the poles. I notice that there's no background. I
Okay.
start to look at what's missing from the picture, so I'm not just seeing stuff, but I'm also seeing what's missing.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
I also put this in more context if I have more, detailed awareness of what am I looking for.
Okay. Let me change this again just a little bit and ask, what if you learned that that image actually represented 2 scarecrows? Let me change this question just a little bit and ask you, when you saw that initial image of just the 2 lines that were crossed, what kind of cultural cues, what things in your past what things did you jump to immediately? And I know that some people said crosses, and whether they meant just cross sticks or whether they meant religious symbols.
Religious symbols, yeah.
To me, it looked like some sort of math exercise.
Or a math exercise? Yeah. Yeah. The point I'm trying to make with these is that it's really important when you're making observations to note and be aware of the assumptions or biases that you bring into a particular situation. From my experience, one of the most difficult places to do observations is in a classroom where I feel I know who all those learners are. And I often, it's easier to look at things and immediately go to inference rather than observation because you have familiarity with that setting. But in action research, you're going to be challenged if you use observation to try to step outside the knowledge that you have of individual children, of groups who work together, and actually look at them in a fairly subjective or objective way, rather, kind of eliminating subjectivity from your perception. And again, that's one of the things that makes observation and action research a little bit different than some of the things that you might do in your classroom where you're trying to respond quickly to situations. All right, I want to now spend a little bit of time talking about interviews, and I'm going to talk about several different kinds of interviews and give you a chance to respond to some questions as we go along. The first type of interview that I want to talk about is a structured interview. A structured interview means that all of the participants, so everyone who we interview, is asked the same questions in the same order. Typically in a structured interview, the questions are very simple and they're direct. And if they're well worded, they shouldn't require additional prompting or explanations from the person who's doing the interviewing. Really important that the questions are not leading. The questions don't suggest what a correct response would be, or they're not worded in such a way that students would be giving the response that they think the person doing the interviewing wants to hear. And of course, questions in structured interviews typically do not have simple yes or no responses. The whole idea of using an interview is to actually get rich data, to get explanations from the person who you're interviewing. And also, the questions in a structured interview don't ask more than one question at a time. And there's a real art to structuring questions to be certain that they're not asking the respondent to respond to two different things or to weigh two different things in their response simultaneously. So given those kind of parameters for what a structured interview is and what a structured interview question is, I wondered if you could give me an example of what this teacher might be asking. And I should say that this is a situation where this is a teacher doing an action research project on literacy. So if you were going to ask a good question in a structured interview, just tell me what that question is, remembering that the question should be simple, direct, they shouldn't require additional prompting or explanation, they shouldn't be leading, they shouldn't have simple yes or no answers, and they shouldn't ask more than one question at a time. If you could type your question into the chat box, please. So just one good question in a structured interview that this person might ask if she was studying literacy. And again, you can base your question on working with students of any age. It doesn't have to be this particular age if you have experience with older students or younger students.
So from Chantel, we've got what is the main idea in this story?
Okay, simple, direct, open-ended.
Georgette, do you like reading?
Georgette's question is one that could possibly be answered by yes or no. So you might actually have a sub-question that would follow that would be, tell me why, or tell me more.
Okay. Yes.
Anjali, how confident do you feel in reading a long text?
Okay.
And Chris is how confident on a scale of 1 to 5 do you about reading this passage?
Okay. Yep, those are both really interesting questions. One of the things that I'm going to suggest is that when you're using an interview, that you actually want to ask questions where you're collecting rich qualitative data. Those questions, although they're very, very good questions, you could easily ask those questions in a survey, which is a much easier technique to use. So Chris has put how do you feel? Yeah. 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 So again, Chris's question could be, how do you feel after you successfully read a difficult passage? Or again, trying to use the question so you're getting rich data out the other end, not short responses. Angela said, what improvements would you like to make in your reading skills?
Definitely what we learned about reading, writing.
Yep. Both really good open-ended questions.
Yeah, but I'm using them.
All right. Thank you for those. I want to talk a little bit about a semi-structured interview. All right. So we just looked at a structured interview. Now we're going to talk about a semi-structured interview. In a semi-structured interview, participants are asked either the same or similar questions based on a predetermined topic. But in a semi-structured interview, the interviewer is free to ask further questions or to change the order of the questions. So for example, if you were doing the interview and a student was not able to respond to certain questions, you could skip question 3, 4, and 5 and just go on to number 6. And you might come back to number 3 or number 4 if you'd skipped those earlier, if it seems that the student is going to be able to respond to those. So in a semi-structured interview, you have a clear idea of what you're trying to ask, but you may not ask all of the questions, you may not ask them in the same order every time, and you may actually add some additional questions for clarification or to get more in-depth information from the person who you're interviewing. As you might expect, taking that one more level to the extreme, you have unstructured interviews. And in this type of interview, the participants are asked generally just one or more open-ended questions that are related to your research topic. So good unstructured interviews are conversational, and again, they're only going to include a few specific questions. And oftentimes in an unstructured interview, to help a participant give a deeper answer, the interviewer may ask questions that are hypothetical or that describe an ideal situation or a contrary point of view. So again, you can see in all of those, what you're trying to do is you're trying to really elicit kind of rich responses and really make the respondent think. So instead of enabling them to give a very, very easy answer, again, you might pose a question that is hypothetical, that's based on an ideal situation, or takes a contrary point of view to get them to really think about the response before they respond. So just an example, if you were studying cooperative learning, you might ask a teacher to describe how they would use this strategy in an ideal classroom setting. So instead of saying, how do you use cooperative learning, or what do you think about cooperative learning, what do you know about cooperative learning, you would say, you could pose it that if you had the ideal class in the ideal classroom, how would you use cooperative learning? And again, one of the benefits of an unstructured interview is the ability to collect really very, very rich data. All of these things that we've talked about so far tend to be interviews that are done one-to-one, although sometimes interviews with younger students may be done with 2 students rather than 1 student at a time. Another really typical technique would be a group interview. And in a group interview, the participants are asked questions together, and the way that they respond will give you information both about group dynamics and about what the individuals of the group think about the topic that you're discussing. If you would choose a group interview as one of your research methods or data collection methods, you need to be really careful to create an environment where everyone in that group feels safe and free to express themselves. So you want to think about what the composition of that group is. You want to really balance if you're working with familiar students, you'd want to really balance students who are very, very outspoken or who might, as well as students who are really reluctant to participate in a verbal conversation. You also might want to tell them if you are going to attribute their comments to them individually, or if you're just going to be attributing the comments to the group. Oftentimes in a group interview, students may say things that they wouldn't say if they knew that you were going to say, and he said or she said. But if you said you were going to say someone in the group said, that sometimes in certain situations can free people to express themselves more honestly. So some examples of topics that might benefit from a group interview could be things like student attitudes toward online bullying, or the role of a dress code in respectful social interactions in a high school. Those kinds of things where certainly feelings, values, emotions would all become part of the data that you're collecting. So what we're going to do now is I am going to show you a series of research questions, and I just want you to tell me if that was your research question, what are some of the data collection methods that you can use? And then we're going to go through those methods one at a time. And if you said formative, or if you said observation, or if you said interview, I'm going to ask you to say just a little bit more about that. You'll see how this is going to work in just a moment. So the first research question, the hypothetical research question that we want to consider is, how would asking higher level questions improve the quality of student participation? If that was your research question, what data collection methods might you use? And type those into the chat box, please. And again, don't type all of them. Type the one that you think that you would most quickly be drawn to be using. So formative assessments, observations, or some type of interview. Observation, one formative. We're still waiting for a couple of people to respond. Barbara and Steph, if you want to put just your initials in front of your response so we know which is coming from.
I tried, but Barbara gasped. Bark.
All right, thank you, Barbara. So Stephanie.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I'm thinking still.
Okay,
Just
that's
in
fine.
terms of, yeah.
Okay, so if we go to the next slide, if you said formative assessment, can you tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking about? So people who said formative assessment were Anjali?
Just everyone.
Yes. So Anjali, say a little bit more about what you were thinking about there.
What I was thinking about is that, you know, if you're looking at quality of student participation and also higher level questions, maybe asking students to create some questions on a topic that you've taught and using this as a tool for formatively assessing the student participation in their learning would be a good idea.
Great, thank you. I think that Anjali was the only person who
Yes, she
said
was.
formative.
Yeah.
If you said observation, can you raise your hand, please, if you'd like to share what you were thinking about? So either Chantal
Chris.
or Chris. Chris, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking what I'd probably do is video the class or get some kind person to volunteer. It's easier if they're watching because I can give them a template that I want them to tick or cross. And I would probably have a grid that said, you know, are the students giving me one-word responses? Are they actually raising their hands to answer the questions? Or are they giving me more detailed responses? Something that I don't then have to focus, because otherwise you change your teaching in order to anticipate what's going on. So I'd rather someone was in the class and tallying that for me. And then, just looking at the quality of, you know, are they just joining in because they want to colour the picture, or are they joining in because they're interested in the topic and they want to develop further? That sort of thing.
Great, thank you very much for that. What about someone who said interviews? And Georgette and Barbara said interviews.
So, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So, I thought interviews, structured interviews, would be a good way of getting information, because I would have a clear idea of what the questions, or what I was trying to get, the information I wanted to get from the students. And I thought if I was, the other method I thought would be a little more hit or miss. I mean, an observation is less directed, so I wanted something that was as directed as possible so that I could zero in on what the target was, what I wanted them to respond to, so that they would have to respond to that.
Great. Thank you very much for that. One of the things that again, I want you to keep in mind is that one of the ways that action research is a little bit different from, perhaps different from your classroom practice, is that when you are asking your action research question, you're going to want to use a range of these data collection methods and do something that we're going to be talking about again in one of our future sessions called data triangulation, which is collecting data from a whole range of these perspectives. So you might do a formative assessment and an observation and an interview, and look for the extent to which the data from those different data collection sources tell you the same things or tell you different things. So again, an important thing to keep in mind. I want to try one more of these questions, and then we're going to go on to the last part of our session today. So this next question is maybe a little bit more open-ended, and even though this one is about math, the question is, how will implementing cooperative learning improve math performance in my class? If you can replace the word math with whatever the subject or the topic is that you teach, just in your own mind. And again, think about, would your inclination be to use formative assessment, observations, or interviews? That's formative. Okay, so again, let's go through these one by one. And if we start with formative, Chris, Steph, Barbara, Chantal all indicated formative. Would anyone like to share some specific kind of things that they were thinking about in choosing formative assessment? Chris, go ahead, please.
I'd probably choose an assessment that linked to performance indicators that I was going to be teaching to. I would give them the assessment before doing the activity. I would then implement cooperative learning and carry it out and then test them again. I might try and encourage another colleague who didn't want to implement this new and interesting thing and get them to do the same thing, but teach it as we normally do or as they normally do, and then try and compare the data from the two sets of results.
Great. So you're using kind of a pre and post test strategy to kind of understand growth over a class period, over a series of class periods.
Looking at performance, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Steph, Barbara, or Chantal, does anyone else want to share what they were thinking about?
Well, Barbara would like me to share. I mean, ultimately, it's about improving student learning. So it would seem that I'm trying different ways in order to improve their ability to apply the learning independently and successfully. So I'm measuring that through this formative assessment, so I'm trying different methods to see if that assessment indicates that their learning is, their knowledge is increasing.
And you can use, after implementing the cooperative learning, formative assessments like quizzes or worksheets or essays, or, you know, a written piece, all that can be used or tried.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to observations and interviews, and I'm going to combine those together because Georgette had indicated both of those, and no one else had chosen those two methods. So Georgette, do you want to just say something about what you were thinking about?
I guess I always fall back to my discipline, which is counseling. So I like to observe, and I like to sort of gather information that way. So giving them an exercise or seeing a classroom in action and observing how they actually connect in learning, as opposed to anything really directed. I think that it just would be raw seeing exactly how cooperative learning works without any kind of stimuli. So. Great,
thank you for that. Yeah, no, I think that in this particular question, although the research question suggests that the researcher is interested in math performance, which of course math performance is something that you would use formative assessment or summative assessment to measure, that one of the things that we know about learning, of course, is that enjoyment and engagement heavily influence the extent to which math performance may or may not improve. And that by using this different approach, using cooperative learning, one of the questions might be to what extent does cooperative learning enhance engagement or enjoyment, and then how does that lead to math performance? So yes, by having by using observations and interviews alongside the formative pieces, if you were working in a subject-based area, you could build a really rich picture of what was happening by using that particular teaching or learning strategy. I'd had one more question, but I think that we really have the hang of it. So I want to go on to our last paired discussion that we're going to have today. And what I would like you to do,
Angelique has left.
Yeah, what I would like you to do is to pull up or pull out your Learning Log 5.1. And Angelique has had to leave. We knew that she had to leave the session a little bit early. So we're going to have Georgette and Chris paired, and Stephanie, Barbara, and Chantal, again, working together this time. Georgette, I'm going to apologize, but one of the first things that you're going to need to do is to share your Skype with Chris, and we're going to give you a little bit more than 5 minutes. I'm not certain why I've written 5 minutes. This should be a 10-minute activity. So,
Ollie, I need my iPad back, I'm afraid, for a minute.
If Chris and Georgette could share their Skype addresses and connect by Skype. And again, Stephanie and Chantal and Barbara, if you guys could go ahead. What I would like you to do is to discuss your responses to Learning Log 5.1, and specifically I would like you to talk about the data collection methods that you have formulated that you might use in your research question. And again, your research question has come from the previous sessions. And please use this time to give each other feedback, to give each other ideas, to think about whether you have created, whether you're suggesting a range of data collection methods that will give you information from, have you considered the use of interviews, of observations, of formative assessment, and really thinking about how those different data collection methods could help you build a rich picture of what may result or what may come out of your research that you might conduct. All right, again, guys, 10 minutes. We will come back on and tell you when there is 1 minute left. We're going to mute the microphone so that if you need to contact us, please type your message into the message box, into the chat box. Thank you. We'll be back with you shortly. 10 minutes, please.
Hi, got 1 minute left if you want to wrap up your conversations. Thank you. Okay, we're back.
Yes.
So I hope you're all ready to join us.
We just have to go upstairs.
All right, let's go.
Good try.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to kind of tie up this week's session by asking if there are any questions that you have at this point, or if any of you would like to share what you talked about in your discussion group. So again, if you could go ahead and raise your hand if you either have a question or if you'd like to share something that you talked about. Chantal, go ahead, please.
All right, well, excuse my voice. But Stephanie and Barbara wanted me to share what I was saying. So my question and my research and the data tools I'll be using is mostly to do with teachers being evaluated against their student learning outcomes. And there's a twofold problem there, which is, do they have the skills and the ability? Are they given the professional development and time and mentoring to be able to reach that? And then on the other side, where do the fears come from? You know, are they just reticent to do this, or do they have a genuine fear? And a model which I wonder why we can't use specifically if we're working towards SLOs with our staff is to do lesson study. Lesson study where a group of teachers working with the same grade or within the same subject actually work together. They do peer assessment, they do peer observation, they develop the questions together, they collect exemplars, they create a fair system of assessment, and without any fear of it being some sort of punitive judgment, they're able to go into each other's classrooms and say, you know, that worked, I'm going to try that. That didn't work. Let's sit together and try and think of better questions. I noticed only 5 of your kids were listening during this period. I saw 2 who weren't able to do that. And as a team, they sit and they develop the lesson. I just think it's, to me, as an administrator, it makes far more sense. You're going to get so much more value out of that because you've got teachers who are growing, learning, collecting data, having professional conversations around the idea of improving student learning outcomes. And instead of me having one great teacher who's getting 20 great results from her children, I've got 4 teachers working together, and I've got 80 kids who are benefiting from that collaboration. So kind of what I was talking about.
Now, Chantal, I think that the kinds of data that you would collect to make that point are, I think that they're really valuable pieces of data. And as I understand it, one of the benefits and one of the reasons why we actually have the Standard 8 pilot group is to look for some of those kinds of ideas to emerge, because I think that the intention of that system is to raise teaching and learning across the board, not just to have it owned by a couple of individuals who, just by virtue of their past experience or their, what they've learned are able to do that. So No, I think that sounds really interesting. But again, thinking about and you mentioned some of the different data sources you would use to make that point, to actually show that this collaborative approach using a method like lesson study will actually produce a better result in the end and may be more appropriate to the way that our school operates than what comes as the standard approach to the STRONG framework. So thank you for that. I should also mention that one of the things that we are looking to develop through the Center for Inspiring Minds is some training courses in lesson study. We're going to be doing the University College London is doing a 5 or 6 month training piece that I'm going to be a part of, and it's meant to train people to be trainers, to be lesson study trainers. So with any luck, that's something that we're going to be bringing to kind of the sim explorations next year. So thanks for that. It prompted me to think about those things as well. Does anyone else have something they want to share or a question at this point? One of the only other things that I would like to add, and because we haven't talked about it very much, is that at the beginning of the course, we did provide for each of you a kind of a textbook or a primary reference source for this course, the Improving Schools Through Action Research book. And I just want to point out that chapter 5 in that book, which runs from page 88 to 122, provides a really, really good introduction and actually some more in-depth information about formative and summative assessment, about observation, and about interviews. So if you thought that you were going to be wanted to kind of consider to look at some of those assessment strategies or data collection strategies as part of what you do with this course, I would really recommend going into that chapter and reading a little bit more about them. As again, that's the main kind of resource reference point we're using for this course, and it does provide some good information. So thank you all again for all of your contributions this week.
Okay, just want to remind you all that there is a second Learning Log 5.2, and I know when we spoke about this last week, most of you said that you prefer to go back and listen to the sessions, and that's really up to you. So, but the option is there should you wish to use this. And the sessions, again, they will be posted online the day after the training happens, so you've got that choice too. This is session 5. Session 6 doesn't happen until the 27th of October, so we now have a week's break. The session 6 materials were sent out yesterday by Ben. I will send out the video from tonight's session plus the training, the go-to training instructions tomorrow for session 6. But we'll see you all virtually online on the 27th of October.
Yep, and I do want to thank all of you who've helped us address some of the technology issues that we were experiencing early on. I hope that for all of you that having the technology run smoothly has it's meant it's a completely different online experience. Yeah. So thank you again. It certainly was different for us, and it's just much easier, much more pleasant when we kind of go through the whole session having solved all of those issues. So thank you very much. I hope everyone has a restful break, and we'll see you back on the 27th of October.
Okay, thank you all. Bye.